What's good, YouTube? Steel here, and this past weekend we saw Sylveon Greninja once again take the win in the largest tournament. However, I feel the meta shifted significantly enough where it warrants a meta update. In this video, we'll be breaking down not only the metagame of the largest tournament, but also taking a deep dive on the performance of some of the top decks in the format. Before we begin, I'd like to ask y'all to please consider subscribing as we inch closer and closer to 700 subscribers. And I'd also like to remind y'all that I stream on YouTube, Twitch, and TikTok Monday through Friday starting at around 11 p.m. Eastern as I continue to climb the ranks of Master Ball. With that out of the way, let's get into this week's meta report. As you can see from the chart to my right, the Sylveon Greninja continues to be the #1 deck in the format, this time taking almost 70% of the entire metagame, which last week it was closer to 12 to 13. However, the rest of the format has slightly shifted, not only with decks that were popular last week dropping down, but some decks that weren't being played at all are now in the forefront. As you can see from Garchomp breaking into the top. Basically, anything that has more than 3% play rate is what I distinguish in the chart. Everything that's under 3 falls under the other category, because otherwise it'd be like way too many slots, basically, and visually it just would be hard to see. But yeah, Garchomp, which wasn't seeing any play the way that it's seeing now, right? It's the Garchomp Sylveon version. There's the Evolutions deck that you see there is the third most played deck. Or both decks that were not seeing much, if any, play the week prior. But something that I love about Pokemon Pocket from the very beginning, it always seems like, despite it being solved, right, we clearly have a #1 deck, a more popular deck. It has won both weeks so far of the Ursi days, but yet the player base is still innovating. The player base is still bringing out decks from out of nowhere, what it seems like, because the cards are there, right? Like, there's things to do, which is something that not many games have. Sometimes, like for example, I come from a Yu-Gi-Oh background. They'll have the same format for months, because regardless of like what's being sent out or brought out from the new sets, the best deck continues to be the best deck. Pokemon Pocket seems to do a good job of like giving us the tools to like make something out of nothing, almost, it feels like. But going back to the actual breakdown of the metagame, we see that decks like Solgaleo and Guzzlord completely fell off in comparison to where they were at the week prior. But now we see decks like Charizard, Eevee, Oricorio's Sylveon being like more used, despite it obviously not being as used as the Sylveon deck. Darktina seems to like never go away. I don't know if it ever will. Like, it's such a strong deck and so consistent at what it does that even when the format shifted to a grass deck that counters Darkrai, it was still at the top. So personally, I'm actually a fan of where the format sits currently and how it keeps being innovated. Like, there's Tapu Koko lists in this tournament that, although they didn't perform as well, they did have success in smaller tournaments like the Magmas. But for now, we just focus on the biggest tournament because it gives us the biggest idea of like what the most like competitive or what the most popular decks are. I also wanted to take a closer look at some of the meta shifts that stood out to me in the form of like Sylveon that we mentioned earlier jumped from 12 to 70%. Although it was the best or most used deck the week prior, it got even more use this week after the win, after its performance against most of the meta. But then we see decks like Stoke Charizard and Sylveon Oricorio that were barely used the week prior in just around 2%, jumping to 7 and 8%. And becoming the second and third most used decks in this tournament. Then there's decks like Darkrai that basically stayed the same, and I don't see them jumping too much or dropping looking forward into the season. But then there's decks like Guzzlord, Solgaleo, and Rampardo Sylveon that completely fell off in the terms of like losing about half or even more of their percentage of the metagame. Then what really stood out to me was Buzzwole. Buzzwole is a deck that has had like 2 different variations throughout all these tournaments that make Limitless have like a hard time differentiating between which lists are being used. In this case, the Pheromosa represents the decks that use double Pheromosa, whether they use double Cyrus or not. And then the Celesteela version is the one that's like only one Pheromosa, clearly, and then they're playing Kartana. Celesteela tends to be the one that had the most success or the most popular in the past format. However, this format, it went into the format being the most popular, but after a poor performance, clearly, if you want to use Buzzwole, your best bet is using the double Pheromosa, where the Cyrus allows you to hit the backline and do more plays, while the traditional version just doesn't cut it out this current format. So we see it clearly here with the representation in the tournament. Now let's take a look at top 64. As you can see, the top performers were Sylveon Greninja and Sylveon Oricorio, as they outperformed their representation of the entire metagame. Decks like Charizard and Eevee, although they seem to have dropped down, basically played at the rate you expected them to. Darkrai, once again, always also is one of like the top performers. It's just too consistent. It does exactly what it wants to do every game, and whether it was with Nihilego or without, the deck we'll be looking at today is actually without Nihilego, which is actually piloted by Criado, a Brazilian player that, if not always in the top 100, is among the top 100 in ranked. So seeing them perform in tournament is one of like those things where like you could take it like a note or two of the decks or the playstyle that they decide to roll with. And for poor performance, I wanted to highlight Garchomp, because although it was among the top like 10 most played decks, when it came to top cut, only one version of Garchomp Sylveon made it. and overall it just didn't have a good performance in the tournament. Now is the part where we take a look at the decks individually and how they performed in the meta. This time you can see that Sylveon Greninja, like we mentioned earlier, jumped from 16% to almost doubled its performance, in the sense of like it made up 16% of the entire metagame, and then in top cut it made up 30%, almost 32. But what keeps surprising me is the overall performance of Sylveon Greninja. Yes, there's that one winner, or in the past case in last week they had 4 out of the top 4, there was 3 of them. But when you look at their overall record, they're barely over 50%. And when you look at their record against the top the most played decks besides itself, you see like 40% win rate against Sylveon Oricorio, Darkrai Giratina, 30% against Sylveon Rampardos. It's under 50 against the Evolutions, just over 50 against Stoke Charizard, and you're just there. At least me personally, I look at these numbers and I'm like, wait, how is this deck doing so good? Well, obviously, like, I guess the elephant in the room is play rate, right? The fact that so many people are on it means they're gonna slip through the cracks regardless. Like eventually, whether it's like you gotta check their matchups really, but eventually, and also it's not impossible for them to win, right? Like this one player that won could have been the 40% that was winning their games against these other guys. But realistically, what happens is that there's so many people on the deck that eventually, like, some of them are going to get through and some of them will have a good run and some of them are going to win. But the other thing that this chart, or what I'm presenting, doesn't show you is how well it does against, like, not necessarily, I guess the off meta decks is the best way to put it, against the Guzzlords, against like all these electric decks that you saw popping up, whether it was Tapu Koko or Luxray or decks like Garchomp. Although these decks are made to like sort of counter the meta, Sylveon Greninja is so consistent that it tends to beat them more often than not. Nonetheless, this is the list used by like the best performing player, the winner actually. As you can see, it's still pretty standard. They're playing their 1 red card, 1 Mars. They ultimately went for double Cyrus. The initial list that were doing pretty well were playing 1 Cyrus, 1 Irida. But at this point, I feel like double Cyrus is the norm. The 1 Cape so that your Sylveon could survive Charizard attacks, your Greninjas could survive Giratinas. Like basically, Giant Cape is really good. The Mars and Red card are very good, especially in the tournament setting. And the Sylveon engine is just like the best thing that has come out of Eevee Grove, and might have come out in like all of Pokemon. It's just so consistent. You draw so many cards, and you can't go wrong with this deck, no matter what the numbers tell you. This is a very strong deck. It's one of the most popular decks, and it's a popular deck for a reason. Then we have the second best performing deck in Sylveon Oricorio. This deck did get second place. As you can see from the metagame, it almost also doubled its play rate from the metagame to the top cut. But when you look at the numbers, these look a lot more promising, despite the win rate being about the same, just over 50%. When it comes to Sylveon Greninja, it's close to a 50-50, but ultimately they have the advantage. When it comes to Darkrai Giratina, it's actually surprising that despite you having Oricorio, you struggle against Darkrai. Granted, if they're playing the poison version, Oricorio is not as like strong, as well as even the standard 2 Darkrai, 2 Giratinas and nothing else, with the Rocky Helmets and the Darkrai being able to hit the Oricorio every turn for 20, and Sylveon Oricorio not having much healing, if at all. It does tend to be a tougher matchup to basically close out than other standard Oricorio lists. But where Oricorio shines is against decks like Charizard, against decks like Eevee. Where it does happen, or could be surprising, is seeing the stats against Sylveon Rampardos, because you would think, oh, the fighting deck will take over. But what ends up happening in Sylveon mirror matches is whoever goes second tends to win it. So it could easily have been, like you see here, it's 6-3 in a favor of Sylveon Oricorio. I'm pretty sure if you look at every single, well, not every single, those 9 matchups, if you see who went first or second, you could almost put money on the fact that it was probably the Oricorio, since it ended up being the winner. But I can't confirm that. It's just my theory, or from my personal experience. As somebody who's played Sylveon Oricorio Zeraora in ranked, when I go against Rampardos, if I'm going second, I feel completely safe. And when I'm going first, I feel completely cooked. Take that as you will. And now looking at the second place list, this is what you see here. They are playing the double Geo, which has become quite standard. The double Oricorio, not everybody's playing it. Something that was surprising that I did not notice when I put this list together for the video is that they were only playing 1 Zeraora. 1 Zeraora and 1 Dawn does feel a little bit greedy, but again, you can't, like, who am I to say? Like, the results speak for themselves, I guess. Personally, I'd probably still play double Zeraora, but feel free to try this deck out and let me know how it goes in the comments down below. Now, the third deck that I want to point out is the deck that never falls, basically that never dies. We have the Darkrai Giratina. I left the Nihilego in the middle because I couldn't think of like a third card to put. Maybe it should have been Rocky Helmet. But as you can see, this time around, its win percentage dropped down to under 50% for like the first time since like the end of last format. All of last format, thanks to Buzzful, it dropped. Then this format, it seems to have like figured its ground, but again, once again, it got humbled once again. As you can see, very good against like the top decks in the form of Sylveon and Sylveon Oricorio. But decks like Charizard, Eevees, Rampardos are able to overpower you. Although what I do like about Dark Argentina is that you feel like you have a fighting chance even against these decks that completely crush you. But overall, you could kind of see where the win rate came. It did very well against the most popular decks, but then everything else was kind of having its way with Darkrai. That might be that they built their deck to counter the more popular things, which is why you have decks that go so far into the tournament, because they're building for what they're expecting to see, and they struggle against, like, I guess the things that they weren't necessarily prepared for. Nonetheless, this time around, I'm showing you a list without Nihilego, because last week we showed you the one with the poison. As mentioned earlier, this was piloted by Criado, which is a Brazilian content creator. They are always among, if not in the top 100. So when I tell you I have full confidence in this list, I mean it. However, Dark Argentina does continue to be one of those decks where it might not be the easiest to pilot, but once you get it down, it's kind of fun how you could feel like you're able to outplay or always play the game. It's one thing that decks like Charizard can't do. Like Charizard, if you don't see the rare candy, you're not going to win the game. Darkrai and Giratina always gives you that feeling where at least you get to play it, right? You get to maneuver with the supporters that you're given, and it's one of my favorite decks to play. Granted, it has a really bad rap because of how dominant it was when it got into the game, but hopefully people are coming around to see that it's actually like very like skill based, and like, I don't know, it's one of my favorite decks. And hopefully I don't get flamed for that. Now, a deck that I actually didn't talk about last weekend, but I actually put it in my 70% win rate decks, is Charizard Sylveon. Charizard Sylveon is one of those decks where, again, as you can see, the win rate is not high. Like every Charizard deck. As overall, it's one of those where, like, let's say 30 people play Charizard, 20 of them are going to completely like die out immediately because they'll just break. They won't have the right hands. 10 of them will have a decent run, and there'll be like 2 that completely dominate. That's basically like Charizard since the beginning of time. Like whether it was the genetic Apex one, whether it's now Stoke Charizard. As you can see, it has terrible win rate against Sylveon Greninja. It has terrible against Valley Oricorio. It has terrible against Rampardos, but then it crushes Darktina. Although it's like a very small sample size, right? It's only 3 more wins than losses, and same thing with Eevee. It's just 1 more win than loss. Overall, Charizard is one of those decks where if it sees what it has to, it's going to win, and if it doesn't, it loses. But then there's obviously worse matchups like Oricorio that give you a problem because Charizard cannot beat Oricorio. So the deck ends up like relying on Flareon. So it's a little hard to like recommend. But again, this is one of those decks that I feel like for ranked is very good. I don't see it performing as well in tournaments ever. And it kind of surprised me when I saw that it was the second most played deck. Nonetheless, let's look at the deck list. As you can see, this is actually a deck that has had multiple iterations throughout. But I feel like they've landed on this. They cut the Guzma and other little supporters just to focus on like Lily and Giant Cape and like having as much health as possible, because that is what ends up winning the game in the long run. The way you get cheesed, they get to beat you even when you see your turn 2 Charizard, is if they're able to like do enough damage between like 2 or 3 Pokemon before you get to knock them all out, since you do have to waste that 1 turn using Stoke. So I do believe the double Lily and the Cape are the best way to go about it, because it gives you the most amount of health to deal with whatever they throw at you. Now let's look at a list that did not exist a week ago, basically, thanks to players like Japanese players that I unfortunately do not know the name of, and then Jody, who like built off of it and made the list that we know today as like basically the standard version of playing it, which we'll look at after I break down the matchups. We see the Leafeon, Flareon, just the evolution deck. It's my favorite deck, the deck I've probably played the most in ranked and had the most success. And as you can see, once again, the win rates aren't really there for like any of these decks, which also just means that any deck is valid, which is something that I actually prefer, especially in this case where like you're not forced to play anything. There's no complaints about like, oh, this deck is OP, although Sylveon Greninja is getting there just out of like how much people are using it. And nonetheless, once it pops off, you see Sylveon Greninja draw so many cards. But then there's Leafeon, Flareon, Sylveon, which is like putting a bunch of evolutions in one deck. Is a lot of fun. As you see, win rate is 50%, but it actually had a decent 50% win rate against the best deck. It did struggle against Oricorio, because the issue with the Oricorio list is that most decks, especially like the list that I'm going to show you, just has 1 out to Oricorio. So whether they're able to defend the Oricorio or set up 2 Oricorios, your only answer is that 1 baby Leafeon. And if they out it, or you're only able to knock out 1 of the Oricorios and then they eventually set up the second one, this deck doesn't really have an answer for that situation. But then, as you can see, it has a great matchup against Darkrai Giratina. And it's one of the few decks that even if they Stoke Charizard turn 2, it manages to be able to knock out the Charizard unless they see all the healing, which is why I believe Charizard with double Lily and the Cape is the best way for it to be run, because there's certain decks like this one that we're looking at now that if you don't heal or don't have any amount of like being able to change the numbers, they will beat you in just regular transfer and just doing their own plays. They will beat the Charizard player. And then unfortunately, Rampardos is one of those decks that if as an Eevee player, if they find the Rampardos, they usually it's just too much unless you're able to set up a lot. Like if they find it too fast and they start swinging for 130, there's very little that you can do. Nonetheless, very fun deck. I highly recommend it if you haven't tried it. And when looking at the list, this has become like quite the standard, or at least my preferred way of playing it, which is like the list. I'm pretty sure Jody's the one that made this exact list. Granted, it's only like a two or three card difference from what was originally presented, but the Mars is very important to just manipulate hands, because if you're able to delay any, like whether it's a mirror match, whether it's a Charizard, whether it's a whatever, even a Greninja, like if you delay them evolving into what they have and you're able to do your plays, you get so ahead, whether it's setting up a Flareon that's going to knock out whatever they end up having, or a Leafeon being able to attack multiple times. It's just great. Red lets you hit some ranges that you can't otherwise. It also helps that with Red and Eevee bag, you're knocking out a whole bunch of Pokemon that are usually safe from damage. Overall, I love this deck. It's so much fun. Again, once again, if you have not tried it, I really recommend it. Yes, there is a learning curve, but once you get past that curve, just like Dartina, just like Buzzwole, it's one of the funner decks to play. Then the final deck I want to look at is Sylveon Rampardos, because although it didn't have that much representation in this tournament, as you can see, it was under 3%. It made 6% of top cut, so it definitely overperformed its metrics. But what made me want to put it or look at it even more was these numbers. Yes, it struggled against Sylveon Oricorio, as we saw earlier, which I personally believe is just a matter of who goes first and who goes second on who wins that matchup. When it comes to the format as a whole, it crushes Sylveon Greninja. It did well against Darkrai. It crushed Charizard. It crushed Eevee. Again, but these are all matchups that if you find Rampardos fast enough, not to mention that Sylveon, it's one of those where if you go second, you win so many of these matches before they could do anything. And as you can see, the win rate was just slightly over 50%, but that's because this deck still struggles against Buzzwoles that tend to still be in the tournament, and it also struggles with Guzzlord, which is still played, right? There's certain decks that aren't as popular as the ones we're seeing here that do give Rampardos a hard time, whether it's because they have too much HP, whether it's because they knock out the fossils before they get anywhere. But overall, this deck continues to dominate, and it bothers me so much because it's in my ranked climb. I feel like my win streaks are always cut short by Rampardos, but nonetheless I have to point it out. And when we look at the list, it really hasn't changed much. In this case, it's again, these lists you have to keep it with treat it with a grain of salt, mainly because there's a lot of cards that are for like the tournament situation. Like Red Card and Mars are very like tournament popular deck cards. I mean, it's cards that you'll see almost in every top deck, because it's what in the long run will help you win more or have a better chance to win certain matchups that you shouldn't be winning. So that's why you see even decks like Rampardos, Sylveon running the Red Card and the Mars. Mars makes sense because it's a porter, but even Red Card, it's just cards that help you win. Maybe if you wanted to play this in ranked, you might swap like the Red Card for a Sabrina, so they have Cyrus and Sabrina. Realistically, this deck is pretty standard. The deck's been solved for months now, since day one basically of the release of Sylveon. But I have to point it out because the performance is there. Ultimately, I hope I didn't like talk your ear off. I know I get off on tangents when I'm just trying to tell y'all what the best decks are or what is being played the most. I'll make a separate video pointing out some of like the rogue decks that maybe you saw on my charts or didn't see mentioned at all that did well in that same tournament. I'll point them out or in their own separate video. It's just here I wanted to focus on the decks that saw enough play where I could break down not only why they did well or why they didn't do well, but also like what they did well against, as well as if their stats show that it will be repeated or possible to do again. I have to admit that my prediction of Sylveon Greninja was off. I truly believe that the deck was going to fall off at least a little bit, but it clearly kept on getting more play and took over once again, winning the entire tournament. Do I believe that it will win every single tournament here on out? It's possible if people just keep on playing it. A good way for a deck to continue winning is if more and more people play it, because ultimately it's just a numbers game at the end of the day. But I am a big fan of where the format is. I hope you guys are too. If not, feel free to comment down below what you don't like about the format, or what would you like to see different, or what decks you feel like I should have talked about. Personally, again, I only mentioned the decks that saw the most play rate because it's the stats that I could actually like tangibly like say, oh, this is why I did this, or this is why I did that, or it needs to better this. Ultimately, any other rogue decks that you might have wanted to see in this video, feel free to comment down below, but I promise you they'll probably be in my 70% win rate video. And with that, I'd like to thank y'all for watching, and above all else, stay pro.